University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's our leader, so he can speak on whatever he wants. But he'll be actually giving some results of from some survey. His interest in the topic of political inclusion is of long standing. I first met him actually when he was a PhD student about 10 years or so ago at Ohio State. So he's been working on this a long time, but he's got some fresh research to present to us. Second will be Ahmad Salaman, who's here from Lebanese American University. He's going to be talking about communitarianism and why a Lebanese would be talking about communitarianism in history to me, but we'll find out. Our third speaker will be Nazan Hassan from Carnegie University, who's done an interesting paper on women in the Egyptian parliament. There's parliamentary gender quotas in all kinds of places with parliamentary representation. What difference does it actually make? So, and I should say Ahmad has a paper out as well that I think is just available for you. So, without any further words, let me turn it over to Kadir. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. After which, after they all have all spoken, we'll try to have some time for discussion.
I'm going to present the findings from a survey that we conducted this May, June, and this is part of the project. I tried to cram in as much information as possible, so it may be a little bit condensed. There are a lot of slides here, so bear with me if you have any questions. Happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So the survey is conducted in 10 countries in the Middle East, 10 Arab countries, focused exclusively on pluralism, inclusion, exclusion of different groups in the region. 8,501 respondents. It was undertaken by YouGov. This is an online survey, so that means it's not representative at the country level. That means our sample is disproportionately male, urban, educated, and wealthy. So that means, we need to take the results with a little bit of caution. I wanted to sort of have this disclaimer at the beginning, but for the most part, I think our results mirror many of the surveys done in the region on particular questions, like the Arab Barometer, for example. So here's the distribution of the sample. Some countries are a little bit small, like Libya, but for the most part, we have, I think, decent sample sizes given our budget and constraints. What you will not see here is, unfortunately, the Gulf countries, and the reason for that is because YouGov told us that they could not ask these questions in the Gulf because of the sensitivity of these questions. We were asking questions about ethnicity, religion, religious, groups in the region, and they said if they do, that might lead to sort of issues with their license as a company. So here's some basic demographics to give you an idea what our sample looks like, in terms of gender distribution, 75-80% male, age distribution, younger, but a lot of actually disproportionate share of older people. Employment, 55% employed, income level, at the right bottom. Religion, significant proportion is Sunni, Muslim. Education, we have a very highly educated respondent sample, and type of region, predominantly urban located. So, to start off, we asked respondents about what were the goals of the Arab Spring protests, and I'm presenting 5 of those questions or topics. And as you can see, there's some variation across different countries. So to give you a quick sort of update, so for each country you have 5 different bars in different colors. So that shows the share of respondents in each country that indicated that particular topic to be of number one sort of concern in Arab Spring protests. So as you can see, there's some variation. Economic situation tends to be a major sort of issue, or social justice seems to be a major issue in many of these countries. Then we asked them the results or the outcomes of the Arab Spring, two specific questions. How strongly do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Rate on your level of agreement, 1 to 4. 1 disagree, 4 agree. The first question is in blue. Following the Arab Spring protests, overall, your country is better off. And as you can see, the mean score, the average score is, in most cases, around 2 or less than 2. And that means people are not happy with the way the Arab Spring unfolded. They don't think their country is better off. Second question, the Arab Spring protests delivered on their intended goals in your country. And as you can see in red, it's actually less sort of successful on that front, but fairly comparable to the results. We asked the same question, the first question, in the outcome format, and as you can see, there is the variation is a little bit more stark here. In a couple of countries like Libya and Tunisia, we see that people think that political freedoms were achieved for the most part. And which makes sense, especially in those two cases where you had leaders or regimes being changed. In Syria, as you can see, that's really not the case. But most importantly, the economic variables, economic situation, social justice, those did not receive any significant traction in the results. You know, the respondents don't think that the Arab Spring protests delivered on those. And this is one of the, I think, crucial issues. You know, they identified those issues as important sort of challenges to be addressed, but in terms of outcomes, they did not get anywhere close. So we asked them who benefited from the Arab Spring protest or Arab Spring process, and they had 3 options. Well, 3 of them are listed here. We had many options, but as you can see, a disproportionate share of respondents, 1 through 5, think that the ruling elites have benefited from this process. And this is true in pretty much every single country. By contrast, middle class did not benefit much, and then poor citizens were definitely much closer to being harmed on average in terms of respondents' scores. And this is, once again, a good indicator that people are not happy with the way things unfolded with the Arab Spring. We asked about specific groups, whether they benefited or not from this, besides ruling elite, middle class, lower class. We asked about Salafis, Shiites, Jews, Islamists, Christians. So keep in mind that we asked about 20 or so specific groups, and I'm just pointing out some of the groups here, which I thought was interesting to see throughout this presentation. And as you can see, several of them are, by and large, sort of average score. There isn't a whole lot of variation. A couple of them think, especially in Libya and Tunisia, they think that Islamists made sort of inroads in terms of benefiting from the Arab Spring protests. And this is obviously, especially in the case of Tunisia, a reflection of how Ennahda has performed in elections. Okay, so we asked them specific questions about how things have changed. 2 of those are here in this slide. How did Sunni-Shiite relations change in the aftermath of the Arab Spring protests? And how did ethnic relations in your country have changed? And the results are 1 through 3. Higher scores indicate improvement, lower scores indicate deterioration. And what we're seeing here is in most countries, it was rated unfavorably, especially in Syria, where obviously there's a civil war. People are not happy with the way these ethnic Sunni Shiite relations are unfolding. We asked them about specifically political issues, women's rights, media freedom, political expression, freedom to choose leaders, and we have some variation here. In Tunisia, in particular, to some degree in Morocco and in Algeria, we see significant sort of agreement with the idea that on those issues, there was progress, there was improvement. In Tunisia, particularly, it's pretty self-evident. And this is true in some other surveys that we've conducted. People are disproportionately happy with the way political freedoms have evolved, but not so much with the economic state of affairs. So now we're asking about specific groups in the survey. So we're asking how they feel about different groups in particular circumstances. So the question is, should a person with the following backgrounds have same rights with other citizens in your country? Here we show only the sort of big categories: a non-Arab citizen, person of a different religion, refugee background, person who speaks a different language. And as you can see, so on the sort of y-axis, you see share of respondents who agree, meaning that that share of the respondents think that those particular groups of people should have equal rights. So as you can see, a lot of them hover around 80%, or some of them above, some of them slightly below. So that's a good sign. I mean, people in general, for about large groups of people, think that it's okay. But when we get to specific groups, when things get a little bit more dicey here. So again, I'm showing you only 5 groups here: Salafis, Shiites, Christians, atheists, and Jews. And so just one point of clarification here. In many of these countries, some of these groups are literally non-existent, with the exception of a couple of thousand people. But still, people have perceptions about those. And as we continue in this presentation, some of them are actually pretty bad. You know, they see them as threats to sort of social, economic, political harmony. We did not define what these particular groups mean. So we did not define who a Salafi is. This is up to the respondent to sort of define, sort of characterize. So we cannot be 100% sure what exactly these results mean, but in a way, we can, I think, sort of infer that it reflects a particular kind of perception of groups of people by individual respondents. Okay, so here what we see is Salafis are viewed largely favorably in terms of citizenship rights. Atheists are not so much, especially in certain countries like Libya, Algeria, Sudan, and Palestine. In other countries where you have a little bit more, I think, a secular background, they're viewed a little bit more favorably. Iraq and Lebanon are among those countries. Shiites, again, shows great variation. In countries like Iraq and Lebanon and Syria, the rates response rates are pretty high. But in some other countries like Libya, Algeria, Egypt, the rates are pretty low. Christians typically have pretty good response rates in terms of they're viewed very favorably. When it comes to Jews, not the same. It reflects in somewhat similar fashion what atheists and Shiites are subject to in terms of perception of Jewish people. Okay, so this doesn't show a lot of variation, but what I did here is sort of categorize the respondents into self-identification with Islamism or not. On the left side, you see non-Islamist respondents. On the right side, you see Islamist respondents. When we go to Islamists, there's a slight drop in how they think these groups of people should have equal citizenship, just to give you a little bit of more information on this. Attitude towards others, once again, we see a slight drop-off between left and right side of the graph here. Once again, this reflects Islamist, I think, religious sort of backgrounds, especially in terms of atheists, to some degree Jewish people, and actually Shiites as well. There's no drop-off, significant drop-off in Christian and Salafi perceptions. Attitudes towards certain groups. So here, I tried to bring in 4 different questions here. So we asked people how they feel about different groups of people on different issues. We asked them whether you'd like to see them as neighbors, as mayor of your city, as member of parliament, or would you like or would you view it favorably that your son or daughter marries a person of this particular background? So here, as you can see, in terms of Salafis, it's pretty consistent across those 4 different categories across different countries. Libya, Algeria, a little bit more favorably. So higher scores indicate more comfortable, lower scores indicate discomfort. In countries like Syria, in particular Syria, that was really bad perception against Salafis for obvious reasons. In Tunisia, in Lebanon, they're pretty low. If you look at male-female distribution, perception of Salafis, not a whole change. Religion, so we asked people, is religion important for you, from not important to very important, 1 to 4. And what we're seeing is, as religious importance increases, people tend to think more favorably of Salafis. And this makes sense. This is consistent with most survey research out there. We asked people their opinions about Islamists. There's a little bit more favorable, as you can see, but with similar countries showing similar sort of favorability ratings towards Islamists, between Islamists and Salafis. Again, here, religion's importance on the upper left graph. As you can see, as religion's importance increases for a person, his or her perception of Islamists improves. And this is true across all countries in the survey. And whether a person is an Islamist or not obviously shapes their perception of Islamists. This is self-evident, but just to put it out there. Perception of atheists in the region, not very good. It's pretty low, as you can see. And this is true in pretty much all indicators across all countries. Lebanon and Iraq are exceptions. Across different groups of countries, Islamists, non-Islamists, it doesn't really change perception of atheists. In terms of educational level, there's some variation in countries like Iraq there, but for the most part, not a whole lot of variation by education level. And religious importance, obviously, if you're less religious, you tend to view atheists more favorably. So that goes, that makes sense. Yes?
Just a quick question. What percent said they were Islamists and non-Islamists?
I believe it was maybe about 30% or so. Yeah.
Or Islamists?
Islamists, yeah. So we asked them, ideological orientation. We had a list of, leftists or centrists or, Arab socialists. Yes, I'm going to take a couple more minutes with your permission. For Christians, it's more favorable, especially if you pay attention to social sort of, or personal level. Being a neighbor is much more favorable towards Christian, or marrying them is a little bit dicey because of religious sort of traditional religious reasons. MP is good, mayor is good. Again, religiosity determines some of that variation for Christians. Jewish people in Iraq, it's much more favorable compared to other countries, Lebanon, to some degree at a personal level in particular, but in other countries it's low. And across different groups, Islamist, non-Islamist doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Educational level, very slight drop-off. Religiosity, again, non-religious people tend to view Jews a little bit more favorably compared to people who indicate that religion is very important in their lives. Shiites, it's a little bit more favorable. Again, it depends on the country. In countries where you have Shiite sort of significant majorities or minorities, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and it's significant. And interestingly, in Egypt, marrying a Shiite doesn't seem to be a big deal compared to other countries. Religiosity makes slight difference, but hit or miss depending on the country. Islamist, non-Islamist, again, doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Lastly, this is one particular group. We asked about Berbers in Northern Africa, and it tends to be decent, with the exception of Egypt, maybe to some degree Tunisia. But we didn't ask in all countries or all of these questions. And Palestinians, lastly, in 2 countries we asked, Lebanon and Syria. It's okay. It's not great. Not great. No. I mean, especially given the fact that there's a huge, favorable public opinion for the Palestinian cause throughout the region. These figures are not well. Last piece of data I want to show is we asked them about which group do you think is the biggest threat to social, religious, economic, ethnic, or political harmony. 5 different questions. And here you can see sort of respondents' answers here. These are total numbers across the region. It was too much information to sort of dissect it by country, but again, Jewish people are pointed out as a big threat in pretty much every single category. And this is really surprising because the share of Jewish population in all of these countries is minuscule. I mean, it's almost non-existent. Salafis are, and Islamists to some degree are viewed as threats to religious harmony and social harmony. Refugees to economic harmony, atheists to religious harmony, and others are, by and large, I think, in expected directions. Shiites in religious harmony. So just a couple of big takeaway points, if I may. So Arab Spring process has largely failed to deliver. I mean, most of these are not really revolutionary findings or anything, but we're just shedding, bringing some empirical data to show that what people have been thinking about these issues. Resulting policies exacerbated perceptions of ongoing economic inequalities. So as we've seen, people had big hopes on economic issues. None of them were delivered. In fact, it has become a larger gap between the wealthier and lower classes. Ethnic religious tensions worsened, according to some of the questions that we have here. Certain minority groups face significant negative perceptions, and this is a big issue, I think, in terms of creating democratic sentiment in the region, in creating a pluralist society. Primordial divisions deemed more threatening than ideological ones. This is based on the observation that people don't like Islamists or Salafis too much, but they don't see them as, so they think that they should have equal citizenship rights. But compared to, Jewish or Christian or, or atheists for that matter, people do think that they should not have equal citizenship rights. So I think that's an important distinction that the data is showing. And the last one is my sort of area of research, something that I paid a little bit more attention, is religion is a primary dynamic shaping perceptions of various minority groups across the region. So people's perceptions of other groups in the country varies with how religious they deem themselves, how much religion important is in their lives, or how Islamist they think they are. So in that sense, I think that's something that we need to be looking a little bit more carefully. I'm running another a project on religious authority in the Middle East. So this is, I think, a very important sort of finding that supports what we are working with on that particular project. Hopefully, in the coming months, we'll sort of present evidence on that front. I'll stop here and happy to answer questions in Q&A. Thank you.
Perhaps can accommodate all these differences and place them in different communities, religious, sectarian, otherwise, despite the differences in one room and make them work together. And this is no easy question as it proved to be. Of course, when we think about the Arab Spring, 2011 was a year that marked so many protests around the region, and the hope was that these protests would yield to a democratic state somehow, given the fact that the protesters calling for freedom, for participation, and so forth. And indeed, we have witnessed for a short period of time the overthrow of dictators and autocrats. As we have experienced in the past few years, that this wasn't really the case. I mean, liberal hopes really disappeared quickly with the surge of violent conflicts, particularly those that polarize the population around sectarian, ethnic, and sometimes tribal lines. And we've seen strong mobilizations of communitarian groups across the region. Just like A.Kadir presented, these differences, everybody is looking to other group with suspicions. And what we witnessed in the past 7 years is a spread out of ethnic and sectarian conflicts in the region, leading to almost the death of 500,000 people, the displacement of more than 20 million people if we speak about Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya in particular. Really, we have the disintegrations of nation states the way we used to see them. And of course, if you look at the trends and displacement, especially in Syria and Iraq, you can see major cleansing taking place, and also in Libya and Yemen. So the question is why liberal model of a state did not really attain, given initial momentum. Well, in my paper I suggest at least 3 major factors prevented realization of a liberal state. First of those is that most of these states in the Middle East are structurally deformed. They were not established by their own population to begin with. They were pretty much colonially formulated and imposed in one way or another to manage colonial interests post-World War II. And therefore, they were not really, states that were formulated by the will of their own populations. Second, the experiences of these states, especially the nationalist project with Abdel Nasser and the Ba'athist parties, really attempted to melt the different groups against their own wills, especially minorities, if we want to speak about minority groups. And therefore the nationalist model also was an imposing model, and it was not really a model inspired by the local population itself. So it lacked legitimacy and led to eventually a dictatorship. And the third factor why these states are not really, as the way they are constructed today, viable, is the fact that contemporary globalization forces, when we are being more and so interconnected, globalization has undermined national state power by making a world pretty much looking flat and interconnected. And the national power has really been on the decline. And at the same time, and this is what I call in my paper double movement, at the same time globalization has interconnected communities across borders and geography, where the national border no longer as important and as relevant. Communities have started to empower themselves across borders. So we see the Shiites, we spoke about the Salafists, we spoke about the Muslim Brotherhoods. We start to see strength across borders, not just only within the confinement of the national borders. For those reasons, the national state project has been very much undermined. And if you look at the fragility state index, you're going to find that 9 out of the highest 50 fragile states in the world are Arab states. So the question for any perhaps proposed state model to be presented to accommodate all these differences we're not talking about, is how we accommodate the multi-communitarian groups who do not want to melt into a single national identity. How do we accommodate that mobility of diversity and plurality? And that's one. Second, how can we depart from the strict sovereign border-defined states into a less sovereign state, especially given the fact that these communities speak across borders and gain their strength and momentum from transnational dynamics. So we have a really difficult task to get our hands on. First, to accommodate diversity despite divisions, and then to establish a state with sovereignty that sometimes is fluid, not so much that built around a strict national boundary. I'm proposing perhaps an option, and I'm calling this option a communitocratic model, a system of what I call communitocracy. Communitocracy is not a democracy. It's a different than democracy. Communitocracy is a system where community rules rather than individuals. And political power is based on the consensus of the different groups rather than by majority, as is democracy. So at least those two particular attributes of communitocracy sets it apart from a democracy and makes it worthy of consideration, in my view. Particularly if we look at different states that are communitocratic, just like Lebanon, and has been able to accommodate diversity despite the many pitfalls and weaknesses in these systems. Yet, Lebanon is an example where it has been able to accommodate all these diversities and establish some level of tolerance and not slip into violence the way other countries, strong countries have. And communitocracy can be of many types to be considered, depends on different states. But the main two communitocratic orders are one, federal order. I consider federalism a form of communitocracy. It is not necessarily a democracy, because it is based on different groups. So it's a rule by different groups, regionally divided, and they are established to formulate governance by consensus rather than majority. Sometimes some aspect of this we see even in the United States, where despite the popular majority, when it comes to presidential election, we end up having instead a different result due to federal nature. Also, when we don't have necessarily groups that are divided along geographic lines to random autonomy, we may establish another form of communitocracy that we call consociational system or consociationalism. If you're familiar with the literature, it is founded by a political scientist called Alan Lippman. Consociational power sharing is a community shared political power regardless of their demographic distributions. Okay, the power is shared along political lines. So you divide our political positions along sectarian or ethnic tribal lines without necessarily resorting to geographical distributions. So that's consociational communitocracy apart from federal. I think either one of those two political systems are more viable to be as options for political rule in the Middle East, given diversity. There are various threats associated with these political systems, and they need to be addressed. One of them there is a possibility that exclusionary politics can emerge, where one community tries to monopolize political power, and you will have eventually separations. This we have experienced in Sudan, where eventually this exclusionary state politics led to the separation of all states. Exclusionary politics can lead to divisions of Iraq or Syria into separate states. So there is a serious threat associated with exclusionary communitarian politics. Nonetheless, there is also inclusionary communitarian politics that one can consider, and we are witnessing some of that in Iraq and Lebanon nowadays, whereby you can devise electoral systems, you can devise power-sharing mechanism in order to undermine exclusionary politics. For instance, a Muslim can vote for a Christian, and a Christian can vote for a Muslim, or can vote for a Muslim and Christian when it comes to election. That undermines the exclusionary aspects of communitarianism. I believe that in a common era for the Middle East, the only ways to really come out from its current crisis and establish some form of plurality in the political process, especially in a country like Syria and Libya, is to formulate some kind of communitarian systems, without which the groups will continue to be polarized and continue to be entrenched in violent conflicts. So, this is an option to be considered. Plenty of research and examination or surveys to be explored in this area, but something to be thought of as an alternative to the nationalist or to the pure liberal democratic model. I think
Just to give a quick brief of the motivation. So what you can see here is basically the percentage of representation of women in the Egyptian parliament throughout the past 60 years, and as you can see, traditionally the percentage has been between 2 to 3%. The major or the trend disruption in the recent parliament has basically been the increase to around 15%. So in the 2015 Egyptian parliament, what we saw is basically that a total of 89 female MPs were members, 65 were elected by a quota, 19 were elected by majoritarian seats, and 14 were appointed by the president. Excuse me, something I need to read. So, basically this was, I had three main research questions. The first one was, so what's going on? What is the so what question? Firstly is whether female MPs have a distinct background characteristics from male MPs. The second one was basically whether are they more or less active when it comes to parliamentary debate, and whether they adopt any different parliamentary agenda than male MPs. And I think the big question is basically whether this taps into the core of political science, which is what is representation? Is representation basically representing direct interests of a specific group with whom the MPs share specific demographic characteristics? And more importantly, when it comes especially to the Middle East, what if a group that has been largely underrepresented would do if it sees a sudden increase in its representation? So there's a lot of theory. I'm not going to go into details with this, but we know basically from history that more inclusive representation means better democracy, means better societal stability, and means inclusive politics. But the difference is basically whether should each group be represented by its own leaders, or in other words, by leaders who share demographic groups, or not. And this is the basic distinction between descriptive representation. So women should be best represented by women. People from lower classes should be best represented by trade union leaders, for example, or vis-a-vis the model of substantive representation, where basically it relates to the trustee model of representation, where you elect an MP or you elect a legislator. It does not have to represent you demographically, but would then represent you in a way that he or she sees best. So the main argument of the paper is basically that we should see sort of a different agenda because women increase in their representation. I have three main mechanisms argued for. The first one is that they do have distinct life experiences than males. And that then produces different interests in politics, a different political agenda. Why is that so? As you can see, there is too much survey evidence in Egypt that women have different societal roles, different life experiences. So this is a recent survey conducted in 2014, as you can see. So 68% of Egyptian men and 76% of Egyptian women believe that women's role should be to take care of home and cook. 98% of men and 85% of women, so gender differences appear not to play a huge role here, think that changing diapers, giving birth to children, feeding children should all be the mother's responsibility. And a very tiny majority of men and women in Egypt think that women can be heads of state. So obviously there is more emphasis on social roles rather than political ones. There is an agreement sort of that both cannot be reconciled. So the second mechanism is that, and this is something again relates to especially countries that increase women representation by gender quota, which is that those who are able to get elected in the country where women are traditionally underrepresented, and especially who get candidates who get picked to be on the list, are more likely to view themselves and be viewed by society as the vanguard or as the elite feminist leaders, who would then translate this into sort of advocacy representation, that they are there because they were feminist leaders and thus their role is to defend women's rights. And the last theory is the critical mass theory, which is basically if you increase representation by a certain group up to a certain level, you would start to see change in the agenda. As you can see, those are this is a picture of Egyptian women at the Egyptian Parliament. As very obvious, if you follow the sessions, they always sit very close to each other. There is even sort of not just solidarity when it comes to agenda setting, but also when it comes to the physical seating arrangement. So what did we do? We basically obtained data from the Egyptian Electoral Commission and the background of MPs to see whether we have different breeds or whether the women MPs are different from their male counterparts. And then we did content analysis of selected parliamentary scripts to answer question 2. Just to get into the more interesting part of the data, the age, we see that female MPs are slightly younger than male MPs by around 5 years. And we see that they're a little bit more educated. So, as you can see here, they have a slightly higher level of postgraduate degrees. Again, it testifies to the fact that in order to be a woman and an MP in Egypt, you have to demonstrate some superior specific abilities than males. And they are much, much less partisan than males. So 77% of them are independents versus 57 of males. And they are slightly more likely to be employed by the government, that's general of Egyptian women. And most importantly, and that's perhaps the most or the strongest result, is that they are much more likely to be elected via quotas. 3/4 of them are elected via quotas as opposed to just 13% of males. So when one tests this to see which ones are statistically significant, the two important things are the age and the electorate path. This might be too much numerical analysis, but basically it tells us here that women are significantly younger, female women are significantly younger than male MPs, and they are much more likely to be elected via quota. So the interesting other part is basically, so what do they say once they get elected into parliament? And the Egyptian parliament produces, maintains, and makes public its parliamentary scripts and its detailed parliamentary scripts. I'm sure many of you who have studied Egypt have seen this, and it's published online, and it's very detailed. So basically, even if an MP sneezes or coughs, this gets recorded in the scripts. And in here it basically says, well, a sound from the back of the room is shouting, shall we please move to another topic? What we did is that we took those and we tried to, we couldn't analyze all the parliamentary scripts because there are millions of pages, so we chose 3 topics that we wanted to be diverse and reflect salient topics. So an economic topic, which is the discussions of the budget bill 2016-17. We wanted to have a women-specific topic, which is toughening sentences against FGM. And we wanted to have a political oversight topic, which is questioning of the Ministry of Subsidies on the wheat safe distribution and storage. So this is very important in Egypt because Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat. And whenever the percentage of locally grown wheat increases, this is a huge political success for a government. And if this whole system of local growing of wheat and selling the wheat to the government at a fixed price gets failed, then it is a huge government problem. What we did is that we picked the parliamentary sessions that addressed those, we hand-coded them, and our unit of analysis was a paragraph. We didn't, I mean, as you can see here, so all the parliamentary scripts are basically divided into paragraphs. So this was one unit of analysis, and this was one unit of analysis, and the unit and the categories, and then in each of these 3 main topics, we divided them into subcategories in order to do the coding, which I will show you in a minute. So, for example, this is just to give you a general overview. These were the number of paragraphs in each topic. So 413, 51, 52. So we coded in total 516 paragraphs. Just by looking at the breakdown of this over males or females, you can see that 13% of all those paragraphs were contributed by females and 87% by males. So, and females again represent almost 15% of parliament, so they're not less active than the male counterparts, but they're more or less contributing in a percentage that reflects their actual membership percentage. So the economic topic, we divided them, or the budget discussions, we divided them into these subtopics. So a paragraph could be talking about the deficit, healthcare, education, employment, subsidies, right to left-wing suggestion, against or pro-government. And these are the results. So the most interesting one is that females or female MPs talk more about education and healthcare than any other topic. So the blue number, the blue percentage is basically the females. If you're interested in the larger picture, not just the gender division, criticism for government is the most talked upon or the most addressed topic. And what was interesting to us, I mean, we expected this because in the literature this is called soft issues. that women basically focus more on things like education, healthcare, subsidies, and women issues. But the interesting part is that they even talked a little bit more about deficit. And when you, these are basically quotes, direct quotes from some of the sessions that tell you how they took up the issue, especially of healthcare and education, very strongly when it comes to budget discussions. So again, for example, talking about funding for hospitals and schools. Again, the statistical analysis tells us or confirms what we see descriptively, which is that female were significantly more likely to talk about healthcare, women issues. What's interesting, and perhaps this tells you why there's a little bit more of them, is that they are less likely to criticize the government. So they are less skeptical of government efforts. Women issues, again, why is this interesting? Because Egypt criminalized FGM in 2008, but in 2014-15, there was a suggestion by a male MP that FGM should be allowed out of religious and scientific reasons if the doctors performed the operation correctly. And this then sparked a backlash, and a female MP suggested a bill to toughen sentence against FGM. So we wanted to see basically again whether, well, female and male MPs, where do they stand for or against FGM, and which argument do they use? So do they use a feminist argument, religious or scientific argument? And this is what we got. So basically, all female MPs were against FGM, and almost all the pro-FGM sentences were made by males, so the orange bar over there. And the second interesting thing is that female MPs predominantly used feminist arguments. As opposed to religious and scientific. So the feminist argument was almost 3 times more employed by female MPs than religious or scientific arguments. Again, these are direct quotes. This is interesting because this is the one. This is the woman that female MP. She's an Al-Azhar scholar. She's a professor at Al-Azhar University, which is a religious university, and then she's the one who basically most used feminist arguments against FGM. And these are direct quotes by her. And this basically confirms that women are more likely to use the feminist arguments and more likely to be against doctors than male MPs. The last thing was political oversight. This was interesting because it's a hard, dry topic. It's not a soft topic and it's not a women topic. And one basically has to be very much critical of government in order to have a distinctive agenda on this. So these were the sub-categories that we coded, the paragraphs on the topic for. As you can see, we wanted to see whether there is rhetorical intervention, use of figures, reference to technical details, reference to regional issues, making suggestions or reference to specific cases. And what we saw is that there is hardly any difference between females and males when it comes to talking about this issue. And this is confirmed again by the statistical analysis. So you can interpret this as saying that women can address dry issues equally as men do. Or you can say that they're not able to advance a distinctive agenda on this issue. So again, this is basically the conclusion. And this is a famous quote, and I think it's confirmed by the analysis, which basically says that when a woman enters politics, it changes her, but it could also change politics. And what we find is that basically women do advance a distinctive agenda when it comes to specific issues. They address more soft issues than women's issues. And the interesting thing is that these probably, especially when it comes to women's issues, they get hardly addressed at all if women are out of the membership of parliament. Thank you.
There are multiple ways to sort of display the data. I mean, I try to be as concise as possible. You know, I could just focus on the improved percentages. So 2 represents stay the same. So these are average figures. So I had to choose a way to sort of represent the data. The question about ruling elites, once again, we didn't define that for the respondents. That's up to them to define whether they perceive it as leaders from before the revolution or, you know, protests or after. I'm not sure. I mean, it could go either way. That's probably a conception of, you know, just there are some imaginary people up there, you know, who control political, social, economic sort of power, and they sustain their power. Right? Individual figures might change, but that group of people maintain sort of control.
So in other words, talking about a political class.
By and large.
However, I would look at it from a different perspective, which is if the majority of them are elected via quota, and then the government and the different state institutions basically had a huge role in drawing up who gets to be on the quota and who gets to be on the list, then you are institutionally picked in order to be less critical of the government. But I mean, it would be interesting to see, just to compare those who are elected via majoritarian mandate, males v females, because I think if you're elected by majoritarian mandate, you're more likely, because you basically are faced every day with people who are dissatisfied with low quality public services, especially in rural Egypt, and then you are more likely to criticize the government for that. The second question is, why are they significantly younger and less partisan? I think again it has to do with the way by which they were elected. If you're handpicked to be on list, then there is a desire to what you would call to upgrade a little bit the demographic, educational, blah 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 background, and thus you're less likely to pick older people or less educated people, etc. That's as far as the age is concerned. As far as the partisan affiliation is concerned, I think, well, women face a lot of difficulties in participating in political party life. In some, I do some surveys and interviews in Egypt, in rural Egypt, and 70% of the Egyptian governorates are still rural governorates. A woman cannot go out after sunset unless there is a male companion. So she cannot attend the meeting, she cannot attend the rally. And actually, I mean, if you've been following Egypt, you would see many election rallies where kids are all over the place. These kids are not there just to party, but they accompany the mothers, and without that, the mothers wouldn't be going out for political rallies. So, I mean, they face a lot of difficulties basically joining parties and being active participants of party politics. What about cabinet positions? I mean, this is a very interesting question, that what I've shown is mirrored in executive appointees. So now we have 2 governors who are females. We have a record number of females in the cabinet. And I think it's interesting, and there is a very interesting case, basically, which is that we have a governor of a rural governorate in Egypt who is a female and a Copt. And if you recall, there was a huge backlash in 2011 when SCAF basically appointed a Coptic governor. I think women are more likely to break taboos and receive a more muted backlash. So basically there were no protests when that female governor who was a Coptic was appointed this time, when of course the political environment is totally different. Egyptians were much more likely to protest in 2011 than now. But even traditional Egyptian sarcasm I haven't seen this time. And I think because people would then are afraid to be seen as attacking a woman who is a governor, as opposed to when they were attacking a male. I think it taps into some cultural issues that for a female to verbally criticize a female governor wouldn't be looked as comfortably as if he is to verbally criticize a male governor. So that, I mean, that's certainly a good thing that will be happening. I'm not sure how eventually this will evolve. I mean, just a very final comment. It's always the same in Egypt that if a female politician fails, then all females are blamed. But if a male politician fails, then he is personally blamed. And if we have now 2 governors or female politicians, if they fail, the whole experiment might fail.
We started slightly late. I have no substantive contribution to this panel, but I have been keeping good time. I'm going to mess up that record by going just a couple minutes over, if that's okay. Maybe take 2 more questions, but I want to privilege Ahmed. Does anybody have a question for Ahmed? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Question, a comment, and then a couple of questions based on that comment. If you look at, if I understood well what you were proposing about communitocracy, if you look at today Bosnia and Herzegovina, right, 23 years after the Dayton peace agreement ended the war, their country is pretty much ungovernable. And from what you can analyze is that it's pretty much implemented the concept you're talking about. So what would you say to that critique, number one? And number two, how is this communitocracy different from consociationalism as developed by Arendt Liebhardt, for instance?
Okay, one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, it's a common question to all panelists, and we may leave it to the end of the conference today. Not for any specific country, uprising happened in different countries. There were reasons that led to that. And so far, what do we think? Are we expecting any more uprisings to happen? Have all the countries, governments, whatever, have met the needs of their people? And that's why we do not expect any uprising to happen again. Just one example, in Egypt, the economy is very bad. And whatever is said, I don't care about, but facts are facts. So where do we stand today? Are we expecting any more uprisings to happen in the area? Thank you.
We do want to get back on schedule, I think. I mean, the Supreme Boss is sitting right next to me, and he's not nodding yet. So let's cut it off there. Ahmed, if you can respond to the question, and then a final word to the panelists. You've got a very general question that might be a good note on which to end. Do you have any final comments about the apparatus for that?
Yeah, I'll answer your second question first. Consociationalism and communitocracy, in an abstract way. Consociationalism is a type of communitocracy. Federalism is another type. Now, as for Bosnia, so it is the same. So as far as Bosnia and Herzegovina, of course, I mean, what I'm saying is that any political system designed necessarily has advantages and disadvantages. And just like Bosnia and Herzegovina, we could speak about Lebanon and Iraq today because they are a form of communitocracies and they have problems, many problems, not just one. There's a stagnation in governance, there is polarization among communities, allegiance to the state is weak because state services is weak. I mean, we could speak on and on about the problems these countries, these consociational power sharing models experience, yet they have advantages as well. Among the advantages is that in Lebanon, for instance, you don't have a dictatorship. That's one. Among the advantages also is that in Lebanon or today in Iraq as well, you have some kind of freedom of expressions. You have, because there is a balance between different communities communitarian groups, there's no necessarily one communitarian group overshadowing others. You have some kind of leeway to speak and to participate and to choose. And another advantages of this political model is that its ability to bring together different groups, communitarian groups that are very polarized, and yet make them work together. And love or hate doesn't matter, but they're working together and they're not fighting one another. And I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina nowadays, despite all the pitfalls, there is no civil war. It's not like Syria. It's not like Yemen. So there are, when you speak political realism, you have to be realistic about your options. You have to recognize your limitations in a country with diversity, polarized diversity, and limited resources and so forth with a region, with a particular region, and then see what can you do with the given. Can you today establish a pure democracy in Syria? Can you establish a pure democracy today in Lebanon and Bosnia and Herzegovina? I think it is really difficult. I think the communitarian power sharing in such circumstances can prove to be more useful to preserve peace at least.
Thank you very much. Any very quick final comment?
Let me answer to that question. According to our survey data, most expectations were not met. People think that only in a handful of countries political freedoms were attained. In particular, economic situation has not improved, social justice has not improved, corruption issue is not addressed. So the underlying causes, most of them are still there. So there's a good chance that with an instigated event of some sort, same kinds of uprisings could come back again, because most of the issues have remained the same. In fact, in some issues, especially ethnic, religious sort of relations, they deteriorate. So there's that.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other final?
Yeah, final remark as well. I think at the moment we're not going to have a revolution for some times. No political protest because of severe fear in the region about civil wars. The experiences brought in front of many population in Syria and elsewhere, in Yemen, Libya, makes people extremely concerned about how to bring about change. In my perception that we will have a significant delay of any political reform or change to happen.
And then you get the final word.
A couple of sentences, I think. We have this similar levels of dissatisfaction as we had in 2011, but the major changes or the major difference is that the option of abrupt radical change, which was there in 2011, has been largely discounted now. And therefore, unless this perception that quick change could make things better starts to come back again, we're less likely to see another wave of protests as we've seen. And I think this is basically the very hard-learned lesson of developments in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Egypt.